Dive into the fiery courtroom drama where faith, law, and power collide. Subscribe and join Karoline now as Cal Morgan reveals the fierce battle behind an unexpected $500 fine that ignited a nationwide fight for religious freedom. Comment below and stay tuned. Truth is our weapon, and no mask can hide the motives. The White House press room buzzed with the usual cacophony of journalists and camera crews when Karoline Leavitt's phone vibrated against the polished wood of her podium. At 32, the youngest press secretary in modern history had mastered the art of maintaining composure under fire. Yet something about this call made her fingers hesitate before answering. The president's voice cut through with characteristic directness. "Karoline, I need you downtown. D.C. local court. There's a religious freedom case I want eyes on." As she slipped the phone back into her blazer pocket, Karoline's hand instinctively rose to touch the small silver cross hanging around her neck. A gift from her grandmother, it had become both her talisman and her quiet testament of faith in a city where power and principle often collided. The cab weaved through Washington's midday traffic, monuments gleaming white against the autumn sky. Karoline reviewed her briefing notes with practiced efficiency, yet found her thoughts returning to the cross against her skin. In a political landscape increasingly hostile to public expressions of faith, even this small symbol had drawn sidelong glances from colleagues who believed religion should remain firmly behind closed doors. "We're here, ma'am," the driver announced, pulling to the curb before the imposing neoclassical courthouse. The building's marble columns stood like sentinels, witnesses to centuries of American justice, sometimes swift, sometimes flawed, but always consequential. Karoline paid the fare and straightened her jacket, professional instincts taking over as she ascended the steps. Inside, the corridor hummed with tension. Reporters clustered in corners, speaking in hushed tones, while court officers maintained an uneasy order. Karoline nodded to familiar faces as she made her way toward courtroom 3. Whatever the president wanted her to witness was clearly drawing attention. Bailiff James Wilson, a 30-year veteran of the court, pushed open the heavy oak doors. "Court is about to reconvene," he announced, his eyes scanning the crowd before briefly meeting Karoline's. Something in his gaze, concern, perhaps warning, made her pulse quicken. The courtroom was nearly at capacity. Karoline slipped into a seat along the back wall, her trained eye cataloging the players, the nervous defendant clutching what appeared to be a religious text, the tight-lipped prosecutor arranging papers, and presiding over it all, Judge Charles Hargrove. Even seated, Hargrove commanded the room. Silver-haired and blade-thin, with wire-rimmed glasses that caught the fluorescent light, he moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to absolute deference. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, arranged files on his bench with practiced precision, her movements betraying a certain tension. "All rise," Wilson called as Hargrove adjusted his robes. The rustle of bodies standing filled the room. Karoline rose with them, feeling the weight of the silver cross against her collarbone like a premonition. Something significant was about to unfold in this courtroom. A clash of ideals that would draw lines between faith and authority, between personal conviction and public position. And Karoline Leavitt, standing at the intersection of politics and principle, had just been summoned to witness it all. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 3 swung closed behind Karoline with the finality of a prison gate. Judge Charles Hargrove presided from his elevated bench like a monarch surveying his domain, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the sterile fluorescent light. The room settled into uneasy silence as the judge's gavel struck once, decisive and sharp. Wilson, the bailiff, stood at attention, his weathered face carefully maintaining neutrality while his eyes revealed concern. Mrs. Thompson arranged documents with methodical precision, her fingers trembling almost imperceptibly as she placed the final folder before the judge. "Court is now in session," Hargrove announced, his voice like dry parchment. He moved through the preliminary matters with practiced efficiency, a judicial machine processing human affairs with cold precision. Yet something in his demeanor changed, almost imperceptibly at first, when his gaze swept across the gallery and found Karoline Leavitt. Or more precisely, when it found the silver cross hanging at her throat. Hargrove's eyes narrowed behind those wire-rimmed spectacles. His rhythm faltered for just a moment, the briefest hesitation that only those watching closely would notice. Mrs. Thompson glanced up, her pen pausing mid-notation. "Miss Leavitt," the judge addressed her directly. his voice carrying an edge that silenced the ambient whispers. "That religious symbol you're wearing. It's inappropriate for my courtroom." The room turned to Karoline in collective surprise. 3 rows ahead, a woman with diamond earrings the size of quarters shifted uncomfortably. Beside her, an attorney with a gold Rolex gleaming beneath his cuff looked down at his notes. Neither had drawn the judge's scrutiny. "Your Honor?" Karoline's voice remained steady despite the sudden spotlight. "The cross, Ms. Leavitt. Remove it or cover it while in my courtroom." Hargrove's words fell like stones in still water, ripples of tension expanding outward. "This is a place of law, not religious display." The bailiff's posture stiffened, almost imperceptibly. Wilson had witnessed 17 years of Hargrove's proceedings, had seen countless religious symbols pass through these doors. Stars of David, hijabs, turbans, many overlooked by the judge, others acknowledged with nothing more than a passing glance. But something about Karoline's cross had triggered a different response. Mrs. Thompson's pen now moved quickly across her notepad, documenting what was rapidly becoming an extraordinary departure from routine procedure. Her eyes darted toward the judicial code of conduct framed on the wall, its words about impartiality and equal treatment suddenly seeming like hollow promises. "Your Honor," Karoline began, her fingers instinctively rising to the silver pendant, "I'm not aware of any court regulation prohibiting. I determine what's appropriate in my courtroom, Ms. Leavitt." Hargrove's interruption sliced through her response. "Remove it now, or face contempt charges." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the sound filling the sudden silence. In that moment, the marble pillars of justice that had seemed so solid outside the courthouse began to appear as mere facade, a theatrical backdrop for the raw exercise of power playing out before them. Bailiff Wilson shifted his weight, his hand moving subtly toward the small notebook in his pocket where he had documented other instances of the judge's selective enforcement. Cases he would later share with Linda Martinez, the Judicial Council investigator who had been quietly building a case for months. Karoline stood her ground, her political instincts warring with personal conviction. This was no longer about a simple silver cross. In the charged atmosphere of Courtroom 3, beneath the cold gaze of Judge Charles Hargrove, the small religious symbol had become something far more consequential, the flashpoint for a battle between institutional authority and individual faith. And as the judge's impatience visibly mounted, Karoline made her choice. The tension in Courtroom 3 crystallized into something tangible as Judge Hargrove's gavel struck the bench with unusual force. "Ms. Leavitt, you are hereby fined $500 for contempt of court." His voice carried the cold authority of a man unaccustomed to challenge. "Your deliberate display of religious symbolism constitutes a disruption to these proceedings." The courtroom inhaled collectively. $500. A punishment so disproportionate it revealed the true nature of what was unfolding. This wasn't about decorum. It was about power. Karoline's expression remained unchanged, a portrait of composed defiance. Where others might have wilted under Hargrove's judicial wrath, she stood taller, the silver cross at her throat catching the fluorescent light. "Your Honor," she responded, her voice clear enough to reach the farthest corner of the now silent room, "I respectfully note that you've permitted numerous religious symbols in this courtroom before. The gentleman in the 3rd row is wearing a Star of David. Ms. Rivera at the prosecution table wears a miraculous medal." She gestured precisely, her legal training evident in every calculated word. "Court records will show your selective enforcement targets only certain faith expressions." The bailiff, James Wilson, maintained his professional stance, but his eyes betrayed recognition of a truth long observed. Beside him, Mrs. Thompson's pen moved faster across her legal pad, documenting what was rapidly becoming historic rather than routine. "You are bordering on additional contempt charges, Ms. Leavitt," Hargrove warned, color rising from beneath his black robe. The mask of judicial impartiality was slipping, revealing something raw and personal underneath. What Hargrove didn't notice was Karoline's phone, strategically positioned in her open purse, its recording function capturing every word. A digital witness that would later prove devastating. "For the record, Your Honor," Karoline continued with surgical precision, "I am exercising my First Amendment right to religious expression in a manner that in no way disrupts these proceedings. Your fine appears to violate both the Free Exercise Clause and the Equal Protection Clause." The gallery stirred. Whispers spread like wildfire across the wooden benches. Karoline had transformed before their eyes, no longer merely a defendant but now a formidable challenger to authority itself. "Ms. Leavitt," Hargrove began, but Karoline wasn't finished. I will be filing a judicial complaint citing Canon 3B5 of the Code of Judicial Conduct, which explicitly prohibits bias or prejudice based on religion. Her voice remained steady, professional, but carried an undercurrent of iron resolve that seemed to resonate through the marble columns. Mrs. Thompson's head lifted from her notes, her eyes widening at Karoline's comprehensive knowledge of judicial ethics. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present. This was no longer an isolated incident, but the beginning of something far larger. Hargrove's knuckles whitened around his gavel. The power dynamic had shifted imperceptibly, but undeniably. His authority, once absolute within these walls, now faced a challenge rooted in something his gavel couldn't silence: the law itself, wielded by someone who understood its protection. "This court is in recess for 15 minutes, he finally announced, rising abruptly. As he disappeared through the door behind the bench, the courtroom erupted into hushed conversations. Karoline remained standing, the silver cross gleaming against her collar. Bailiff Wilson approached slowly, his voice low. "Ms. Leavitt, I've documented 17 similar incidents over the past year. Judge Hargrove has never enforced this so-called rule against religious symbols before, at least not against certain people." "I know," Karoline replied quietly. "And I believe Linda Martinez at the Judicial Council would be very interested in comparing notes." Wilson nodded almost imperceptibly. "She already is." What had begun as a $500 fine was transforming into something that would eventually cost Judge Charles Hargrove far more: his reputation, his authority, and ultimately his bench. The small silver cross had become the catalyst for exposing years of unchecked bias. In courtroom 3, the balance of power had shifted. Karoline Leavitt had just lit a fuse that would eventually dismantle an entire system of judicial prejudice, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply the courage to stand one's ground. The silence that descended upon courtroom 3 was the kind that precedes revolution. Karoline Leavitt stood unflinching before Judge Hargrove, her silver cross no longer merely jewelry, but a battle standard in what was rapidly becoming a constitutional showdown. With the methodical precision of a legal surgeon, Karoline began to dismantle the judge's authority. "Your Honor, the First Amendment expressly protects religious expression from government interference. The Supreme Court in Cantwell v. Connecticut established that neither federal nor state officials may compel citizens to abandon religious symbols in public spaces, including courtrooms." Karoline's voice carried the weight of centuries of constitutional law. Her words weren't emotional pleas, but razor-sharp legal instruments, each one precisely targeted. "Furthermore, Your Honor, in Capitol Square Review Board v. Panett, the court held that religious symbols cannot be singled out for discriminatory treatment based on their content." The gallery watched, transfixed, as this masterclass in constitutional defense unfolded. Judge Hargrove's face hardened with each citation, his judicial armor cracking under the onslaught of legal precedent. "The record should reflect," Karoline continued, her phone still recording in her purse, "that Your Honor has permitted no fewer than 14 different religious symbols in this courtroom over the past month alone, none of which resulted in contempt charges." Mrs. Thompson's pen paused mid-stroke. The court clerk had documented many of Judge Hargrove's inconsistencies, but never had they been so publicly and precisely catalogued. "The selective enforcement of an unwritten rule against a Christian symbol constitutes both religious discrimination under the First Amendment and violates equal protection guarantees under the 14th. The courtroom had become a battlefield of ideas, with Karoline advancing methodically across every legal front. Judge Hargrove, accustomed to being the most knowledgeable person in his domain, found himself outflanked by a woman half his age with twice his constitutional understanding. "Ms. Leavitt," he attempted to interject, but for perhaps the first time in his judicial career, words failed him. The power imbalance that had defined courtroom 3 for years was inverting before everyone's eyes. The bailiff, James Wilson, maintained his stoic demeanor, but his subtle nod toward Karoline revealed his silent alliance with justice rather than authority. "Should Your Honor persist in this unconstitutional fine," Karoline concluded with devastating calm, "I am prepared to file not only an immediate appeal but also a formal complaint with the Judicial Conduct Commission, supported by documented evidence of disparate treatment based on religious affiliation." The reference to documented evidence wasn't subtle. Judge Hargrove's gaze flickered momentarily to Karoline's purse, understanding dawning that his words were being preserved beyond Mrs. Thompson's official transcript. What had begun as a simple fine for contempt had transmuted into something far more significant: a constitutional chess match where Karoline had maneuvered the judge into check. "Court will recess for 30 minutes, Hargrove finally managed, the words emerging strained from a throat tight with unaccustomed defeat. As the judge retreated to his chambers, Linda Martinez, the Judicial Council investigator who had been quietly observing from the back row, approached Karoline with professional admiration. "That was extraordinary," she murmured. "We've been building a case against Hargrove's pattern of religious bias for months. Your confrontation just provided the capstone evidence." The true victory wasn't merely Karoline's individual stand, but what it represented. The law, properly wielded by the informed citizen, remained the ultimate check against tyranny, even when that tyranny wore judicial robes. In Courtroom 3, the young press secretary with a silver cross had accomplished what armies of attorneys had not. She had exposed the fragility of unchecked power when confronted by constitutional truth. The revolution wouldn't be televised, but thanks to Karoline's recording, it would be heard in judicial chambers across the country. The fine wasn't just being challenged, a system of selective justice was being dismantled, one Supreme Court citation at a time. The aftershocks of Karoline Leavitt's constitutional stand reverberated far beyond Courtroom 3. What began as one woman's refusal to remove a silver cross had catalyzed into a nationwide reckoning on judicial accountability. Linda Martinez moved through the Judicial Council's offices with determined precision, assembling a case that had been years in the making. Her investigation into Judge Hargrove wasn't merely about a single act of religious discrimination, but rather the exposure of a pattern that had gone unchallenged for too long. "We've documented 17 similar incidents in Hargrove's courtroom alone," Martinez explained to her supervisors, spreading photographs across the conference table. "And Ms. Leavitt's recording provides irrefutable evidence of selective enforcement." Meanwhile, Karoline's confrontation had escaped the confines of that small courtroom and ignited the digital landscape. The recording, released strategically across social media platforms, accumulated millions of views within hours. The cross around her neck, once a simple expression of faith, had transformed into a symbol of resistance against judicial overreach. Conservative commentators seized the narrative. "What we're witnessing," declared one prominent voice, "is the unmasking of the administrative state's contempt for people of faith." But this wasn't merely partisan outrage. Mainstream legal scholars and civil liberties experts found themselves in rare agreement that the judge's actions represented a textbook violation of First Amendment protections. In his chambers, Judge Charles Hargrove watched his carefully constructed kingdom crumble. The phone calls from the Judicial Council were becoming more frequent, their tone increasingly severe. Mrs. Thompson, his once loyal clerk, had submitted her own affidavit detailing years of discriminatory behavior she had witnessed and reluctantly documented. "The council is requesting your presence for a formal hearing next Tuesday," his assistant informed him. Unable to meet his eyes, Hargrove's suspension came 3 days later. His resignation followed within a week. James Wilson, the court bailiff who had silently witnessed years of Hargrove's selective justice, finally spoke to reporters. There was always an unwritten hierarchy in that courtroom. Some symbols, some beliefs, some people were treated with deference. Others faced contempt. The only difference was who was wearing the symbol and what it represented. Karoline Leavitt refused most interview requests, making a single statement. "This was never about me or my cross. It was about equal application of constitutional principles." When power selectively targets faith, we all lose something precious, whether we're religious or not. The $500 fine was not only dismissed, but became a fundraising benchmark. Within days, supporters had established a legal defense fund for similar cases, each donation increment set at exactly $500, a deliberate echo of Hargrove's attempted punishment. At the Judicial Council, Linda Martinez's investigation expanded beyond a single judge to examine systemic bias across the district. Hargrove wasn't an anomaly, she concluded in her preliminary report. He was a symptom of institutional failure to enforce constitutional protections equally. The reforms that followed were the kind that only come from public exposure too glaring to ignore. Mandatory constitutional refresher courses for sitting judges, transparent reporting mechanisms for courtroom discrimination, and citizen oversight panels with actual enforcement authority. What history would remember wasn't the silver cross that sparked the confrontation, but rather how a prepared citizen armed with constitutional knowledge and unwavering resolve had revealed the fragility of unchecked authority. When Karoline returned to courtroom 3 months later, This time as an observer for a judicial accountability organization, she wore the same silver cross. The new judge nodded respectfully as she entered. The revolution hadn't required violence or even raised voices, only a citizen who knew her rights and refused to surrender them, even when power demanded their sacrifice. What began as a solitary stand in a small courthouse had transformed into something America hadn't witnessed in decades, a genuine constitutional awakening. Karoline Leavitt, once merely a citizen defending her silver cross, now stood at the center of a movement that was reshaping judicial accountability across the nation. The media dubbed it the Silver Cross Revolution, but unlike most modern American revolutions, this one achieved victory not through violence or partisan fury, but through the meticulous application of constitutional principles. Freedom isn't just a word we celebrate on holidays, Karoline told a gathering of law students at Georgetown. It's a daily practice that requires vigilance, knowledge, and sometimes personal sacrifice. Across judicial districts, the reforms came swiftly. Mandatory First Amendment training became standard for all court personnel. Citizen oversight committees, once dismissed as unnecessary, were established with actual enforcement authority. The Judicial Council, emboldened by public support, implemented transparency requirements that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Even Judge Hargrove's former colleagues found themselves subject to scrutiny they'd never anticipated. 3 more judges in the same district resigned, rather than face investigation for similar patterns of selective enforcement against religious expression. Linda Martinez, whose investigation had expanded far beyond a single judge, now headed a special task force examining systemic bias. What we found in Judge Hargrove's courtroom wasn't an aberration, she testified before a congressional committee. It was the visible symptom of an invisible disease affecting our judicial system. The belief that some symbols, some faiths, deserve protection while others can be suppressed with impunity. James Wilson, the bailiff whose quiet testimony had corroborated Karoline's experience, found himself unexpectedly promoted to training coordinator for court security personnel. The Constitution isn't just for lawyers, he reminded each new class. Every person who works in these buildings has an obligation to recognize when rights are being violated, even when the violation comes from the bench. Mrs. Thompson, the clerk whose meticulous records had provided crucial evidence, received the Justice Department Citizenship Award for moral courage in public service. Her acceptance speech was brief but pointed. "I documented what I saw because someday I knew someone would be brave enough to challenge it." Karoline Leavitt was that someone. The silver cross that had once made Karoline a target in courtroom 3 now appeared on lapel pins worn by advocates for judicial accountability in courthouses nationwide. What had been a symbol of personal faith had transformed into something more, a reminder that constitutional rights either protect everyone equally or they protect no one at all. Karoline herself remained more focused on reform than recognition. She declined book deals and speaking tours, instead establishing a legal clinic specializing in First Amendment cases for citizens from all faith traditions, or no faith at all. "The principles that protected my silver cross must also protect the hijab, the yarmulke, and yes, even the right to wear no religious symbol whatsoever," she explained. Selective enforcement is the enemy of liberty, regardless of which group it temporarily favors. A year after her confrontation with Judge Hargrove, Karoline returned to courtroom 3 to observe the newly appointed judge. The courtroom was transformed, not just by new personnel, but by the palpable sense that those who administered justice were now themselves accountable to the very Constitution they had sworn to uphold. As she took her seat, Karoline nodded to several observers wearing religious symbols from diverse traditions. The silver cross around her neck caught the light as she opened her notebook. A small victory, perhaps, in the broader landscape of American justice. But as history has repeatedly shown, the most profound revolutions often begin with a single act of principled defiance against power that believed itself beyond challenge. This story reveals the power of courage, knowledge, and unwavering resolve against biased authority. When personal faith and professional duty collide, standing firm with truth and wielding the law as a shield can topple even the most entrenched systems of power. Karoline Leavitt's triumph is a testament. In modern America, real change begins with one fearless voice challenging injustice, shining a light bright enough to reform and inspire an entire nation.